Hello and welcome back once again to Infinite Jeff, the project where I, Jeff, read the book Infinite Jest to you. One page at a time, one day at a time. Put it up on YouTube for you to listen to whenever you want to. It's a book by David Foster Wallace, published 1996. David Foster Wallace, incidentally, is the guy staring at you from the thumbnail right now. Right as we speak. Anyway, we are on to page number 217 of this book. This book of the Dead. This Necronomicon, if you will. Anyway, page number 217. Let us get right to it. More dialogue. It's just about this. Anyway. Same order, but not the same family, might resemble one another, as they stand watching and hashing out matters. Hal and Pemulus, there's the thud and sprong of an EWD transnational catapult off way below to their left, and then the keen sound of a waste displacement projectile the clouds are too low to let them see the flight of. Though a weirdly yellow sheep-shaped cloud is visible somewhat up off past Acton, connecting the horizon seam to some kind of coming storm front held off by the Ask Me fans along the Lowell Methuen stretch of border northwest. Pemulus finally nixes the notion of performing the spirited controlled experiment here in Enfield, where Exford has to be at the A Squad's dawn drills every morning at 0500, and also Hal, unless he slept over at HMH the night before, with HMH just not being a good DMZ dropping venue at all. Pemulus, scanning up and down the length of the fence and winking at Mario, posits that a solid 36 hours of demand-free time will be advisable for any interaction with the incredibly potent You-Know-Whatsky. That also lets out the inter-academy thing with Port Washington tomorrow, for which Charles Tavis has chartered 2 buses, because so many ETA players are getting to go and do battle in this one. Port Washington Academy is gargantuan, the Xerox Incorporated of North American tennis academies, with over 300 students and 64 courts, half of which they'll have already put under warm inflatable Testar cover as of like Halloween. PW staff being less into the value of elemental suffering than shit and co. So many that Tavis will almost surely go ahead and bust them all back up from Long Island just as soon as the post-competitive dance is over, rather than shell out for all those motel rooms without corporate support. This ETAPW meet and buffet and dance are a private inter-academy tradition, an epic rivalry almost a decade old. Plus, Pemulus says he'll need a couple of weeks of quality med library stacks tossing time to do the more exacting titration and side effects research Hal agrees the soldier's sobering story seems to dictate. So, they conclude, the window of opportunity looks to be November 20th, 21st. The weekend right after the big end of fiscal year fundraising exhibition with the ETA A and B squads in singles against, this year, Quebec's notoriously hapless Junior Davis and Junior Whiteman Cup squads, footnote 74, invited down under the very quiet, low-profile political conditions via the good expatriate offices of Avril Incandenza to get vivisected by Wayne and Hal et al. For the philanthropic amusement of ETA patrons and alums. Then to dance the PM away at a catered supper and alumni ball, the weekend right before Thanksgiving week in the Whataburger Invitational in sunny Arizona. Because this year, in addition to Friday, November 20th, they also get Saturday, November 21st off, as in from both class and practice, because CT and shit have arranged a special one-match doubles exhibition for the Saturday AM following the big meet. One between 2 female coaches of the Quebecois Whitemans and ETA's infamous Vaught twins, Karen and Sharon Vaught. 17 OANANs. And that is the end of page number 217 of Infinite Jests. I hope you had as much fun listening to it as I did reading it. Good night. 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 Yandu. 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 Good night. Good night.